We live by a code. That code says you go after people when they're in peril, when they're in the service of their country. We did not have the benefit of hindsight in the early hours, and those people who are in peril in the future need to know that we will go get them, and we will do everything we can to get them out of harm's way. That night unfolded in ways that no one could have predicted when it first started. And it is my strong belief then, as it is now, that we needed to demonstrate that resolve, even if we'd still had the same outcome.
Mr. Chairman.
I think that look forward to it. Actually, all time has expired. We now go to the gentlelady from Illinois who's been patiently waiting, Ms. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too would like to thank you for your service and thank you for your patience and endurance sitting here almost 3 hours, and my condolences to the family. Mr. Hicks, I would like to ask you about your testimony involving the flight from Tripoli to Benghazi. First, in your interview with the committee, you explained that the first plane from Tripoli to Benghazi left on the night of the attack around 1:15 a.m. Is that correct?
No, it arrived in Benghazi about 1:15.
It arrived, okay. The ARB report says that the first plane had a 7-person security team, which included 2 military personnel. Is that correct?
Yes, it did.
Now, you also told the committee that a second flight left Tripoli the next morning, September 12th, between 6 and 6:30 a.m. Is that correct?
I think the flight actually left a little later, but again, the timelines are still not have merged to a great extent, given time.
Okay. You said that 4 military personnel were told not to board that plane and that this call came from Special Operations Command Africa. Is that right?
That's what I understand.
Okay. During the interview, you were asked if you knew what was the rationale that you were given that they couldn't go ultimately. And you explained, I guess they just didn't have the right authority from the right level. Is that correct?
I think that's correct.
Okay. So you basically don't know why they were told not to get on the plane.
I have no idea why they were told why they were not allowed to go to the plane, go get on that airplane.
Thank you. Just this morning, the Department of Defense released a press release, if I can read it. The team leader called Special Operations Command Africa to update them that the movement of U.S. personnel to the Tripoli annex was complete. He then reported his intention to move his team to Benghazi aboard the Libyan C-130. As the mission in Benghazi at that point had shifted to evacuation, the Special Operations Command Africa Operations Center directed him to continue providing support to the embassy in Tripoli. We continue to believe that there was nothing this group could have done had they arrived in Benghazi, and they performed superbly in Tripoli. In fact, when the first aircraft arrived back in Tripoli, these 4 played a key role in receiving, treating, and moving the wounded. I'd like to yield the rest of my time to Mr. Conley.
I thank my colleague.
Does the gentlelady want that in the record?
Yes, please.
Without objection, it will be placed in the record.
Mr. Hicks, you quoted, you said rather emphatically that the video had no material impact on Libya.
That's correct.
And you talked several times about phone conversations with the Prime Minister, who referred to it as a terrorist act, not as a protest. Is that correct?
That's
President.
Oh, the President. But we don't want to leave a misimpression here. I mean, the Libyan government is somewhat incoherent at this time. I mean, it's hardly
correct.
a unified government.
That's correct.
And for example, you were busy on the day, but on September 12th, the New York Times published a story quoting Libya's Deputy Interior Minister, Wanis al-Sharif, who said that his initial instinct was to avoid inflaming the situation by risking a confrontation with people angry about the video in Libya. He said he also criticized the Americans at the mission for failing to heed what he said was the Libyan government's advice to pull its personnel or beef up its security, especially in light of recent violence in the city and the likelihood that the video would provoke protests. That same article interviewed people engaged in the assault in Benghazi who cited, according to the New York Times, the 14-minute video, that this was due to their anger. Now, my only point is, the Libyan government didn't speak with just one voice. There were disparate voices. Some, in fact, did see the video, apparently, at the time, as an influence. And it's a little I don't want to mislead the public that there was one unified perspective and that narrative is entirely false and was at the time. Would you care to comment?
Sure, our assessment in the embassy was that, the video was not an instigator of anything that was going on in Libya. Now, I understand that these people were quoted. In fact, on September 20th, Prime Minister Al-Kib raised the video in front of the press when Deputy Secretary Burns was there. But we saw no demonstrations related to the video anywhere in Libya. The only event that transpired was the attack on our consulate on the night of September 11th.
Thank you very much. I thank my colleague. Mr. Chairman, if there's no objection, I'd like to enter into the record the full New York Times article dated September 12th, Libya attack brings challenge for U.S.
I certainly think under the circumstances it would be appropriate to put into the record something that says that we were stupid to still have a consulate in Benghazi, that it was an unreasonable risk and it should have been closed down in light of the danger, and in fact they may have been a video reaction. I think that's a good balance.
I thank the chairman for that unanimous consent comment.
With that, we go to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, to the families, thank you for the heroism that your sons exhibited. I would tell you that. To the three of you at the stand, thank you for your bravery, particularly in light of how we treated whistleblowers today and in the past. Mr. Hicks, did you ever question officials in Washington about what Secretary Rice said on Sunday, the Sunday talk shows?
Yes, again, when Assistant Secretary Jones called me after the talk show event, I asked her why she had said there was a demonstration when we had reported that there was an attack.
Was she the only one that you talked
Yes.
to? Okay. And her reaction was?
Her reaction again was, I don't know, and it was very clear that from the tone that I should not proceed with any further.
So she was very curt.
Yes.
Okay. Did you receive any negative feedback based on this conversation?
Over the next month, I began to receive counseling from Assistant Secretary Jones about my management style, things that I basically was already doing on the ground, but nevertheless, I implemented everything that she asked me to do.
Something that you were highly recommended and highly accommodated for. They're questioning it all of a sudden. Can I have the video to be played on the screen, please?
The fact is, we had 4 dead Americans. Was it because of a protest, or was it because of guys out for a walk one night who decided they'd go kill some Americans? What difference at this point does it make? It is our job to figure out what happened and do everything we can to prevent it from ever happening again.
Well, I'm really mad, but Mr. Hicks, can I give you the opportunity to respond to that question? What difference does it make?
I think the question is, what difference did it make?
Yep.
President Magariev was insulted in front of his own people, in front of the world. His credibility was reduced. His ability to lead his own country was damaged. He was angry. A friend of mine who ate dinner with him in New York during the UN season told me that he was still steamed about the talk shows 2 weeks later. And I definitely believe that it negatively affected our ability to get the FBI team quickly to Benghazi.
So that definitely impacted getting the FBI to look at the crime scene, did it not?
Absolutely.
So when you talked to the Libyan government, were they responsive when you asked about access for the FBI?
It was a long slog of 17 days to get the FBI team to Benghazi, working with various ministries to get ultimately agreement to support that visit to get them to Benghazi. But we accomplished that mission. But again, at the highest levels of the government, there was never really a positive approval.
So this false labeling was a spontaneous reaction to a video, was a direct contravention of the explanation offered by this president of Libya. And the facts on the ground impact our ability to investigate the crime scene afterward. How long was it, as you said, before the FBI was allowed access into Benghazi to examine that crime scene?
17 days.
17 days. Was the crime scene secured during that time?
No, it was not. We repeatedly asked the government of Libya to secure the crime scene and prevent interlopers, but they were unable to do so.
So let me get the timeline finalized here. So the FBI is sitting in Tripoli for weeks, waiting for the approval of the Libyan government to travel to Benghazi. Is that appropriate?
Well, they were attempting to do their job from Tripoli as best they could.
But they were denied access into Benghazi, right?
Correct.
So what were they doing with their time?
They were interviewing witnesses that they could find in Tripoli and could meet with in Tripoli, and they were also engaging with the government in order to develop a cooperative investigation with the Libyans who had sent an investigator to Benghazi.
Were you interviewed by the FBI?
No, I was never interviewed by the FBI.
Never. Nice story. I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. And, you know, it's my understanding that we've had 9 oversight hearings on Benghazi since the horrific attacks on our consulate on September 11th, 2012. And like many of my colleagues have expressed to the family, I believe that we need to continue to do everything within our power as Congress to get to the solutions and the recommendations that will prevent this from happening again. And I think that in addition to our condolences, the things that we need to do most is our job to come up with the recommendations to prevent this. One of the overall conclusions of the Accountability Review Board was just that, quote, that Congress must do its part to meet this challenge and provide necessary resources to the State Department to address security risks and meet mission imperatives. That was a direct statement out of the Review Board recommendation. And I think each of you agree that Congress must do its part. Am I correct? Yes or no, real quick.
Yes.
So, you know, Mr. Chairman, I just would hope that after this hearing, after 9 oversight hearings, that we will begin to work on some specific recommendations that we can bring forward, and that all of us working together can do our job to protect our embassies. I think that's what the public wants. I believe and hope that that's what the families want in the memory and the legacy of those who lost their lives. And I would say that it does cost money. Mr. Nordstrom, I know you say it's not just about money, but it also is about properly prioritizing budget considerations. And, you know, in the past, you know, my colleagues on the other side have not been willing to make the kinds of serious and sustained commitments to funding that are necessary for large-scale and long-term security projects like building facility improvements, for example.
Would the gentleman yield briefly?
May I?
Of course.
Thank you. And so in both the 2011 and 2012 budget cycles, the budgets gave the State Department hundreds of millions of dollars less than what was requested. The fiscal year 2013 budget as proposed by the other side proposed even more cuts. They want to reduce international affairs budget by more than $5 billion less than it was in fiscal year 12. That is a 9.8% cut to diplomatic security when extrapolated across the whole foreign affairs budget. By the fiscal year 2016, the proposed budget by the other side further cuts funding to international affairs by another $5 billion. This represents a 20% cut to diplomatic security when extrapolated over the entire foreign affairs budget. So these are serious and significant cuts, and we cannot pretend that they don't have consequences. And so I know that my colleagues have talked several times about holding people accountable. Well, I hope that one of those groups that we will hold accountable are ourselves, as members of Congress, to do our job to properly fund the safety of our embassies so that this never happens again. I urge my Republican counterparts to work with us in a bipartisan effort to actually fund these improvements to our embassy security and to follow through on the 29 ARB recommendations that have already been made and those that we believe should also be supported from this hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My condolences to all the families and everybody who suffered from this tragedy. And also, I hope that you pray for us that we do the right thing as policy makers and not as politicians. Mr. Nordstrom, you've stated here that you felt the security situation in Benghazi was unsafe. As a matter of fact, you've been very clear on placing blame with a number of people. So given everything that was going on at the time and everything you have said today and what you said on October 10th, at any point did you suggest to Ambassador Stevens that he should not travel to Benghazi on September 11th's anniversary, and that the situation was volatile and that the facility, per your own assessment, was not secure?
I had departed post on the 26th of July, so I didn't have the opportunity to do that. I would defer that to the RSO that was there at the time, John Martinek. It's my understanding that he also had raised some concerns and discussed that.
So you have your opinions today, but you did not have those same opinions back then?
I wasn't at post
Okay.
for September 11th. I departed 6 weeks prior, so.
If the gentleman would indulge, I think he's asking, what was your opinion on the day you left relative to Benghazi?
Oh, okay, I understand. I had actually met with the ambassador prior to that as part of an out briefing, and he and I talked about kind of the way forward, and the threats in the East were something that we talked about. I had mentioned that in October as well. It was very concerning to us, the increase in the targeting. It was something that I had mentioned back to our headquarters in reporting. It was something that the Ministry of Interior brought up when the ambassador went and met with the minister in July to talk about requesting static security. They highlighted, number one, growing extremism in the East, particularly in Benghazi, in Derna, and Sirte. So absolutely, that was something that we discussed, and we were concerned in particular that we were not getting the resources.
So you stressed that you did stress concerns, but not to the point where you said, I wouldn't go if I were you, or
we never had that discussion, in part because the ambassador had not indicated any sort of desire to travel to Benghazi. My hope would have been that they would have had resources there to augment any such travel.
And resources require other kinds of resources. I mean, if you have resources on the ground, they require actual funding, etc. There's a balance to creating the kind of atmosphere and security that would be required to meet any concerns, correct?
Sure. In what we were looking at is that you were going to have a downsizing of personnel in Tripoli. So anytime the ambassador would have traveled, that would have impacted security of both locations because you would have been splitting up resources, which is what I think ultimately happened.
Mr. Hicks, can you shed some light on this discussion that we're having?
In the two planning meetings that we had for Ambassador Stevens' trip to Benghazi, Regional Security Officer John Martinek raised serious concerns about his travel. Because of those concerns, the ambassador adjusted his plans for that trip. First, he agreed that he would go in a low-profile way. His trip would not be announced in advance. We would not do any planning of meetings until right before he went. Second, he eventually decided also to shorten his trip. He initially had planned to go on the 8th. He went on the 10th instead to narrow the time frame that he would be in Tripoli. The third step that he took was the one public event that he planned would take place at the very end of his trip, just before he left.
So basically, you're describing what I feel to be consistent. What I've known of the ambassador is that he was very, very committed. He did listen to advice, etc., but he was very determined, and he continued to do his job.
Exactly. He went there to do his job. He felt that he had a political imperative to go to Benghazi and represent the United States there in order to move the project forward to make the Benghazi consulate a permanent constituent post.
Okay. I'm so proud of his commitment, and that is very consistent with everybody who's come across him. I just hope that we can have that commitment up here as elected officials to do the right thing so this never happens again. Thank you so much.
Thompson, concerning the role of the Counterterrorism Bureau. Now, Mr. Thompson, your lawyer said you were unwilling to talk with any Democratic member of this committee, so I've had to rely on statements that were made to the press. Your own statement is mostly biographical about the work you've done in Yemen and Latin America and the rest. Now, one report I found indicated that you believe that Secretary Clinton and Ambassador Patrick Kennedy, and here I'm quoting from this report, tried to cut the Counterterrorism Bureau out of the loop as they and other Obama administration officials weighed how to respond to and characterize the Benghazi attacks. Now, that's the end of that quote. Mr. Thompson, I'm asking you, is that quote accurate, that you believe that the Counterterrorism Bureau was intentionally kept out of the loop for political reasons?
It is not. I indicated that the portion of the Counterterrorism Bureau that responds to crises, i.e. part of the office, was pushed out of that discussion. The Counterterrorism Bureau was represented in subsequent meetings after the night of 9/11.
So, do you believe you were kept out for political reasons? This quote makes it...
I do not politicize my job, madam. I have served under 3 presidents, starting with President Clinton up to the present. I've served 6 secretaries.
I've got to continue. Mr. Thompson, I was just quoting the quote. So the quote isn't entirely accurate then?
Correct.
All right. That's very important for the record. That Mr. Thompson is not saying that they were kept out of the loop for political reasons. This week, this quote apparently caused your former boss in the Counterterrorism Bureau at the State Department, I'm speaking now of Ambassador Daniel Benjamin, to issue a public statement disagreeing with this allegation in particular, which was in quotes. And he said, and I am now quoting him, "It has been alleged that the State Department's Counterterrorism Bureau was cut out of the discussion and decision-making in the aftermath of the Benghazi attacks. I ran the Bureau then, and I can say with certainty that as the former coordinator for counterterrorism, that this charge is simply untrue." Do you agree with Ambassador Benjamin?
I agree that the Counterterrorism Bureau was included, but there's a distinction with a difference with respect to the portion of the Counterterrorism Bureau that would be most effective in the aftermath of an attack.
Now, all of this was under Ambassador
Compound.
Benjamin. He didn't say one portion or the other. You are yourself saying, although the Bureau was represented, somehow some portions of the Bureau were not represented. And how is that?
That's what happened, ma'am.
It says the Bureau, he says going on, was a central participant in the interagency discussion about the longer-term response to Benghazi. At no time was the Bureau sidelined or otherwise kept from carrying out its task. This seems to me to directly contradict your testimony here today. He says,
I respectfully disagree.
we were all in. You say, well, yeah, you were in, but somehow the other, some part of it was not in.
No other part of the Counterterrorism Bureau is responsible for responding to a crisis. This was a crisis. My office was not involved in those subsequent meetings. Other members of the office were very professional people, and I'm sure they did their best at those meetings.
Well, we certainly don't want to get involved in who down the chain of line gets consulted. But the ambassador says after the attack, the first question to arise that involved the Counterterrorism Bureau was whether or not the Foreign Emergency Support Team should be deployed. The question of deployment was posed early, and the department decided against such a deployment. In my view, it was appropriate to pose the question, and the decision was a correct one. And now, were you aware that your superiors were consulted about the decision not to employ the Foreign Emergency Support Team?
You can go ahead and
as
answer,
earlier
you can go ahead and answer that, although the gentlelady's time has expired. Answer.
As earlier indicated, ma'am, I was told that by the Undersecretary of Management's office. The normal process for deploying the team is that at the Assistant Secretary level, at a counterterrorism security group at the White House, those options are discussed. At that convening of that CSG, that decision is recommended or not recommended to the Deputies Committee. It is not solely a State Department function or authority to launch the Foreign Emergency Support Team, even though we are one part of it.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the
Attorney, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hicks, let me start by acknowledging how riveting your testimony was of the events of that day and evening, and thanking you for your service and your activity, for sharing with us all the brave acts that occurred that night. I don't think we've heard enough of that. And I think it's important for the American people to know how many individuals, both in Tripoli and in Libya, responded so very well and bravely on that. So thank you for sharing that and for your service as well. We have an important responsibility here, and that is to ensure that whatever happened that night and whatever we learned from what could have been done better actually gets fixed. And I think that's a legitimate process for this committee to do. I hope we move on that basis. I know that, we had accountability review boards set up immediately in the wake of all of this, and they were rather harsh in the determination on that. And in fact, they made some 29 different recommendations on that, and we should be finding out whether or not the Secretary of State and the Department are implementing those recommendations and how expeditiously. And I hope that at some point we can get to that, which I think would be the appropriate role for the government. And I know that two of the three witnesses here this morning actually spoke with the Accountability Review Board, and the third certainly knew of his right to speak and chose not to contact them for whatever reason on that. But earlier this week, I think disturbingly, the chairman went on to national television and actually accused the administration of deliberately misleading the American people about the attacks in Benghazi. For somebody that's earned the term of being a whopper, making a statement of a whopper and four Pinocchios, it's a little bit shocking to think that kind of a statement would be made without any apparent backup. The basis for the extreme charge were apparently statements made by Ambassador Rice on news shows the Sunday after the attacks. And the comments were allegedly that talking points were provided by the intelligence community were supposedly manipulated for political purposes. What was quoted by the chairman at that TV show is, "Clearly the American public was deliberately misled," said the whopper, and it was a political decision, close quote. Mr. Hicks, you told our investigators that you weren't involved with the drafting of those talking points, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And Mr. Nordstrom, you weren't involved either, is that correct?
No, I was not.
And Mr. Thompson, you also were not involved, is that right?
Yes, Congressman, but however, I offered my services to the ARB, and I did not try to keep myself out of that process, just for the record.
Good, thank you. And we know that there were conflicting reports about what happened, including a statement by a Libyan official that there had been a demonstration and some eyewitness accounts of that protest. But Mr. Hicks, we know that you didn't believe that there was a protest. You believed that it was otherwise. And we know that the president of Libya also contradicted with that statement on that. But the intelligence community insisted it received initial reporting suggesting there was a demonstration. We know that the reporting was wrong. Now we know that. But the mention of a demonstration was put into talking points by the intelligence committee, not the White House or the State Department. So I want to play a little video here, if we can, of General Clapper, where he specifically addresses the attacks on Ambassador Rice. We have that queued up.
And when she was highly criticized for following them, what was your feeling inside? Your own personal belief. Did you think it was fair that she be criticized?
Well, I thought it was unfair because the hits she took. I didn't think that was appropriate, and she was going on what we had given her, and that was our collective best judgment at the time as to what should have been said.
Thank you.
So General Clapper says that he thinks the attacks on Ambassador Rice were unfair. She was using exactly what the intelligence community gave her. Mr. Hicks, do you have an argument with his veracity when he made those statements?
There was no report from the U.S. mission in Libya of a demonstration.
The difficult question I have for you, because you're good enough to come forward, is do you contest the General Clapper's veracity? Is he lying, or is he telling the truth of what information he gave Ambassador Rice?
I don't know anything about the development of those talking points.
So, look, we haven't investigated this issue yet. It'd be interesting to know, but the House Intelligence Committee has. They got all of the draft talking points. They got the briefings and testimony from CIA officials. According to Adam Schiff, one of the representatives that's on and part of that investigation, he said, I quote, General Petraeus, the former head of the CIA, made it clear that the change was made to protect classified sources of information, not to spin it, not to politicize it, and it wasn't done at the direction of the White House. And we might, as an aside, we might be interested in protecting classified information because we've had situations where people in the majority have gone to Libya and come back and had a real flare-up about what they disclosed concerning classified information. But in addition, there was a bipartisan report issued by Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins that similarly stated, and I quote, no changes were made for political reasons and there was no attempt to mislead the American people about what happened in Benghazi. So people who have actually seen the documents, who have actually conducted a real investigation, completely reject the allegation that they were made for political purposes or to deliberately mislead the American people. With that, I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Tierney.
I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. The Accountability Review Board made a number of recommendations to better strengthen overseas embassies and missions like the one in Benghazi. Mr. Nordstrom, you told our staff that you read the ARB's unclassified report and recommendations. Do you think that implementing these recommendations is important to ensure the safety and security of our foreign service?
Absolutely. I had an opportunity to review that along with the other two committee reports. I think taken all together, they're fairly comprehensive and reasonable.
And I guess a diplomat like you probably feels very disheartened when you read in the paper, say you're overseas, that Congress has cut this budget for embassy security, and Congress has been cheap, on the cheap, of providing protection to our personnel. In order to make security possible at our missions and our embassies throughout the world, it's one recommendation in this report that attempts to grapple with these issues and err on the side of increased attention to prioritization and the fuller support for people and facilities engaged in working in high-risk, high-threat areas. The solution requires a more serious and sustained commitment from Congress to support State Department needs, which in total constitute a small percentage both of the full national budget and that spent for national security. But it's exactly what we in Congress have failed to do in the past. Let's look at our record. House Republicans voted to cut the administration's request for embassy security funding by $128 million, and that was in fiscal year 2011. In fiscal year 2012, they cut the request by even more, providing $331 million less than requested. You know, our Republican counterparts have just said that these cuts are based on their priorities and choices. And when asked whether he voted to cut diplomatic security by over $300 million on CNN, Representative Chaffetz responded, absolutely. Look, we have to make priorities and choices in this country. But these cuts have impacts, serious impacts. And I want you to know that my priorities, including funding these recommendations, which will save lives. You know, the ARB, Mr. Norsom, just to be clear, you provided information to the ARB, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And Mr. Hicks, is it true that you also provided information?
The ARB interview,
ARB,
yes.
you know, it was led by Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen, who happens to be the former chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. In its investigation, the review board interviewed more than 100 people, reviewed thousands of pages of documents, and viewed hours of videotapes. The board made 29 recommendations to improve security systems and procedures to prevent future deadly attacks. And a key finding made by the board related to availability of funding. It's specifically for temporary facilities in high-risk, high-threat environments. And the board stated, the department should develop minimum security standards for occupancy of temporary facilities in high-risk, high-threat environments and seek greater flexibility for the use of Bureau of Overseas Buildings Operations sources of funding so that they can be rapidly made available for security upgrades at such facilities. And it is important to note that the facility in Benghazi was designated as a temporary facility. Mr. Nordstrom, do you agree with the board's review?
That was actually one of the specific things that I talked with the board. My concern is there is no such thing when you look at the FAM or the OSPB standards for a temporary facility. And so by its very nature...
So they developed the recommendation.
After the fact.
How about you, Mr. Hicks? Do you agree with the recommendation?
I'm not a security expert. I'm a diplomat. I'm an economic officer. But I support every improvement that can possibly be made to improve our security overseas, including increasing the training of our personnel.
I thank the gentleman. I would also thank the gentleman from Missouri, but ask, were you here on October 10th when the person who had those requests for additional security said money was not a factor, Charlene Lamb? Do you remember her?
I can't remember if I was at this.
So, Mr. Nordstrom, you were on that panel. Do you remember what she said?
Yes, she said that resources was not an issue, and I think I would also point to the ARB report, if I'm not mistaken, that they talked to our chief financial officer with DS, who also said that resources were not an issue. So.
Mr. Chairman, the ARB says resources were an issue.
Well, I guess the question that I have about the ARB, and again, it's not what the ARB has, is what it doesn't have, and that it stopped short of the very people that need to be asked those questions, and that's the Undersecretary of Management and above. Those are perfect questions that he needs.
And I'm sure that if we implement some of the recommendations, it will help us prevent a future attack.
And I appreciate that. And what I would say is that in the earlier hearing in October 10th, The one thing we did discover is, yes, this facility was not able to take the blows even of a small bomb that had gone off earlier. Mr. Nordstrom testified to the fact that this consulate, temporary consulate, had been attacked twice, and they'd breached the wall. So there was an awful lot of recognition that it was an insufficient facility, and I think that's ARB, no ARB, that's something that's well in the committee's record, but I thank you for bringing it out.
They were our very best. I don't want that part to be overlooked. These individuals were regarded as our very best, including Ambassador Stevens, without question. I think his opinion and the respect that his experience and authority in matters, all matters in Lebanon, Libya, and not only in Tripoli but also in Benghazi was unquestioned, I think. And it showed in the deference that others gave him to those decisions. I thought the ARB report especially did single out some areas where I thought they were trying to identify where the decisions that were made may have been deficient. And they do identify at page 30. They talk about the Bureau of Diplomatic Security and NEA, the Near Eastern Affairs, and at Post, there appeared to be a very real confusion over who ultimately was responsible and empowered to make decisions based on policy and security considerations. They go on further to say the DS Bureau showed a lack of proactive senior leadership with respect to Benghazi, failing to ensure that the priority security needs of a high-risk, high-threat post were met. And at the same time, with the tension in late 2011 shifting to a growing crisis in Egypt and Syria, the NEA Bureau's front office showed a lack of ownership of Benghazi's security issues and a tendency to rely totally on diplomatic security for the latter. The board also found that Embassy Tripoli leadership, saddled with their own staffing and security challenges, did not single out a special need for increased security for Benghazi. Now, what they point to in the next couple of paragraphs is they thought that the result, that the special mission Benghazi extension, that this was a temporary residential facility not officially notified to the host government, even though it was also a full-time office facility, resulted in the special mission compound being accepted from office facility standards and accountability under Secure Embassy Construction and Counterterrorism Act of 1999. Mr. Nordstrom, your point exactly. And the Overseas Security Policy Board, OSPB. So what they're saying is because there was an extension made, that there was a lowering in expectation there, that the resources for physical security and also the personnel assignments needed at that was not given an adequate priority, and that it was left to diplomatic security in some cases to make those repairs. Is that something that you see as being a weak point in this whole process that allowed Benghazi to be ill-prepared for the attacks on September 11th?
I do. As I said, I think that what still remains unseen is who made that decision to go ahead and assume that this is going to be a temporary facility. At one point, in fact, I was told by colleagues in OBO and DS that the recommendations that we wanted to make, the upgrades, both in Tripoli and Benghazi, would not be made. They forwarded us the way forward documents that we discussed in October. And they said, and I quote, "It's my understanding that M, Undersecretary for Management, agreed to the current compounds being set up in occupied condition as is." The ARB in particular found it interesting at my reply, which was in February of 2013. I requested, "Is anything in writing? If so, I'd like a copy for post so we have it handy for the ARB." That's 8 months before the attack.
Right.
I got no confirmation as to who made those decisions, nor did I get a copy of that.
And so the status was still in limbo at that point? I know there was some discussions with Mr. Langford earlier, the gentleman from Oklahoma, that...
My understanding was the facility, again, the types of facilities are whether or not you're sole occupancy of the building, or are you a partial occupancy of, say, a commercial building, or if you are in a building which is owned by the host nation. Well, clearly we were the sole occupant, and that's the standards. It's very clear, and it's based on our threat and those standards. We did not meet any of those standards, with the exception of perhaps the height of the wall.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired.
I thank you. Just one thing, you used the term M for the Undersecretary for Management. Who was that?
At the time and throughout all of this was Patrick Kennedy, who was up here in October as well.
So that's who would have been the person who said no, or this is good enough, presumably.
Presumably, again, I don't know what the decisions, the factors were in his decision. I'm sure he had reasons for those decisions. I'm not going to criticize those. My only concern is that nobody has looked at those, whether it be the ARB or anybody else.
All civilian USG personnel in Libya were under Chief of Mission Authority, which was
yours
until we knew that he was dead, and then that passed to me. The 4 members of the Special Forces team were under General Ham's authority. We had 2 other military Special Forces personnel in country, and I was at that time unclear as to whether they were under my authority or not.
So anyone you had under your authority, you gave orders to, they responded, they went down range if you asked them to. The others were not allowed to.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Connolly, thank you very much. You'll have your full time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the clarification. By the way, there have been some statements that Undersecretary Kennedy was not interviewed by the ARB by Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen. That is a misstatement of fact. He most certainly was. You can look it up. It's documented. He was interviewed, and he provided evidence, and that evidence was evaluated. So it is simply not true that Undersecretary Kennedy was not part of that process. He most certainly was. And I'd ask, Mr. Chairman, the record so reflect.
Who said he wasn't? I'm not sure.
I think we've heard it from the table. Mr. Thompson, statements have been attributed to you that your bureau, the Counterterrorism Bureau, was actually deliberately kept out of post-Benghazi developments, decision-making, and so forth. Are those statements attributed to you accurate?
It's true that my portion of this office was not participating.
Your portion. To whom did you report?
I report to Dan Benjamin at the time.
And did Mr. Benjamin, was he included in
He was overseas at the time.
He was overseas, but was he kept informed and involved?
I kept him informed in the early stages of...
Was he kept informed and involved by the Secretary's office?
I have no idea.
Would it surprise you to learn that he has stated emphatically that he most certainly was?
Wouldn't be a surprise. I've read it.
And would it surprise you that he contradicts your statements or statements attributed to you? And I read to you this charge that we were kept out of the loop in the aftermath is simply untrue. Though I was out of the country on official travel at the time of the attack, I was in frequent contact with the department. At no time did I feel the Bureau was in any way being left out of deliberations that it should have been part of, unquote.
I would disagree. He's true factually. He is his view of how much of CT Bureau was.
So for the record,
if I may, sir, if he thinks he was adequately informed and given counsel on that, then that is his professional.
Well, he's the head of the Bureau, and he's, in fact, was your supervisor, and that's his testimony. So it contradicts you.
I don't think it's his testimony, sir.
Well, I'm entering it into the record, so it's now on the evidentiary record. And
with the gentleman,
we could no, I will, Mr. Chairman.
I'll hold the time.
Okay, certainly.
Mr. Cummings, perhaps you were here, perhaps not, has said among a lot of people that we want to bring before this committee, he is now an anticipated future witness, so he can give testimony.
The chairman anticipated exactly the point I was going to make, so we can clear that up by having Mr. Benjamin here. Thank you. Mr. Hicks, I don't think anyone who could have listened to your account, the minute-by-minute account of what happened, could be anything but moved. The trauma of what you and your colleagues must have gone through, especially being in Tripoli, not being able physically to sort of reach out and do something about Benghazi, I think all of us can relate to that. Terrible. I was in Libya, in Tripoli, in May of last year before the tragedy, and I don't remember whether we had a chance to meet or not, but David Dreyer led our CODEL. We were not allowed to stay in Libya overnight. What struck me when I arrived in Tripoli was that airport security was provided by a militia. And, you know, I've traveled a lot over my years in foreign policy, and, you know, what goes through the mind is what could go wrong with this? It's a volatile, violent, unstable, or was, situation. Do you want to talk just a little bit about the domestic situation in Libya as we found it? Because I think sometimes that gets forgotten in the retelling that we're facing instability in Libya still in a post-Gaddafi revolutionary situation, and likewise in Benghazi. Could you just share with us some insights into what you found in terms of that inherent instability?
Thank you, Mr. Connolly, and thank you for being my representative. First of all, I just want to say that I don't recall saying that anyone other than myself testified to the ARB or was a witness before the ARB. So I wanted to be clear about that. The second thing is the political and security climate in Libya at the time. It was highly unstable, although after the elections, we thought that the political trajectory, the elections in July, we thought the political trajectory was heading in the right direction. President Magariaf had been selected. They were trying to appoint a new prime minister and move towards a democratic government. The security scene, however, was very unstable and has been, I think, well documented. You had assassinations and car bombings in Benghazi, but the assessment was that this was Libyan on Libyan and not necessarily directed at foreigners. At the same time that we are in the process of building towards making our post in Benghazi a permanent post, the British are contemplating returning there to Benghazi. They left after their ambassador survived an assassination attempt in June. In Tripoli, we also have instability. We have car bombings, carjackings. We have Islamic extremist militias that begin to attack Sufi shrines, and a government that is struggling to maintain security and improve security in the country.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, if I could just say to my constituent, we're proud of you, and I would add my voice to that of Mr. Cummings. I'm a member of not only this committee but the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and you have my personal pledge that were there ever to be any hint of retaliation or retribution for your willingness to come forth and tell your version of what happened, this member of Congress will intervene on your behalf forcefully.
Young lady from California, Ms. Spear.
Mr. Chairman, you know, it's ironic that you said that, Mr. Chairman, since Mr. Thompson would not even engage with the Democratic side of the aisle in terms of answering any series of questions. But let me, first of all, say to the family members, we lost extraordinary servants to this country. You lost loved ones. And there's nothing that we can say that will ever heal your huge loss. But know that we will do everything in our power to make sure that other families do not go through what you're going through. To you, Mr. Hicks, thank you for your extraordinary service. You know, as you were retelling the events, and they were harrowing, it reminded me of an experience that I had, similar, in a foreign country, ambushed, and a sense that we were woefully underprotected. And I think as part of what we're going to glean from this today is that we have got to do a much better job of providing protection in high-risk, high-threat embassies and consul offices around the world. It was inadequate, and I'm troubled by the fact that General Ham withdrew additional support because they had been engaged in a carjacking. If anything, that would heighten our concern and we would create more support. Let me, though, ask you a question. You said earlier today that the lawyers at state told you not to talk to Mr. Chaffetz when he came. That's what I wrote down. And would you just verify that that's what you said?
We were not to be personally interviewed by Congressman Chaffetz.
Now, in your interview with the committee, you were asked the question, excuse me, did you receive any direction about information that Congressman Chaffetz shouldn't be given from Washington? And your answer was, no, I did not. Is that still your testimony today?
I don't recall that phrase, and
well,
then I thought that I said, and I'd have to review again, that I did receive instructions exactly as I said them, but I did not know who gave them to me, because I did not have, at that time, have access to my email from my time as DCM in Tripoli.
If the gentlelady could just tell us what page of the transcript that's on.
Maybe the staff can get it for me. I'm reading from a separate
thank you.
Document. You did say that you were told to make sure other State Department officials were present for meetings with Representative Chaffetz. As you stated, they told me not to be isolated with Congressman Chaffetz. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what I mean by not to have a personal interview with Congressman Chaffetz.
Okay, so it was more about not being in a situation where you did not have other people with you. Is that correct? As opposed to not being interviewed.
And again, that's what I said. Not to have not to be personally interviewed by Congressman Chaffetz.
It said, well, you said they told me not to be isolated with Congressman Chaffetz.
That's the meaning of isolated, not to be personally interviewed.
There was a classified briefing for Mr. Chaffetz that no other State Department official was able to attend, and you testified earlier. So, as a result, no other State Department officials can confirm what was said if there was a mischaracterization after the fact. So when Representative Chaffetz returned to Washington and attended this committee's hearing in October, there was a great deal of controversy about his description of that classified briefing. Did you by chance watch the hearing?
Actually, I didn't, but I don't think I said that no State Department official was allowed in that annex briefing. In fact, I was in that briefing, David McFarland was in that briefing, and the RSO John Martinek was in.
The attorney was not.
The attorney was excluded by the annex chief for clearance purposes.
Okay, when you received a call from Cheryl Mills, actually, let me ask you a different question.
The gentlelady's time has expired, but go ahead and ask your last question quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you deserve to have a post in a location that you desire. So I would like to ask you, where would you like to be posted?
The Court of King James is out of the question.
The country I would most like to go to, is that the question
Yes.
that you're and be assigned to? You know, I'd really want to talk to my decision maker, chief decision maker in my family, who's sitting right over here, my wife, because I think her opinion is more important than mine on that point.
And so, just to conclude, Mr. Chairman, I believe...
He really is a diplomat, Ms. Pierce.
Well, most of you should be diplomats on issues like that. Ms. Dibble has said to you that she would help you get a good onward assignment. And I think this committee will help you get a good onward assignment. So we await your, the responsible person for that decision informing us.
I thank the gentlelady, and I'm actually shocked that Mr. Connolly didn't make that a promise to a constituent who could vote. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the families again of those who lost their lives in Benghazi. You have our condolences, and I think the best tribute we can give to those who've lost their lives is to make sure that we make sure this doesn't happen again. And I think that's really the goal of the committee. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. Mr. Hicks, especially thank you for your extensive conversation about what happened during the confusion of those first hours, whether the ambassador was at the hospital or the annex and all that happened. I can tell you about 16 years ago, I was backpacking through the Darien Gap in Colombia and woke up to machine gun fire and hand grenades. And at the time, we didn't know what happened. We had paramilitaries on the river, we had guerrillas behind us, and we were caught in between. So I can fully understand the full confusion that happened at that time, and your recanting of that, and I think we saw that in the report. What I can tell you, though, Mr. Chairman, is, I don't think there's a smoking gun today. I don't even think there's a lukewarm slingshot. What we have is some strong opinions from people who at least I know Mr. Nordstrom and Mr. Hicks both participated in the study, and Mr. Thompson, while he didn't, no one stopped him. No one said he shouldn't go in the study, but we've had a chance to take a look at this, and I think what's really imperative is that we make sure that these recommendations are done, that something concrete comes out of this so that no one else is in this situation. And I think one of the real things that we can do as a committee, as individuals on this committee, is to make sure that we provide adequate funding for security and training to all of our embassies. And I think, that I'm one of the new folks around here. So when I look at some of the past budgets where we've been asked for literally hundreds of millions of dollars that haven't been approved in a post 9/11 world, I look at that as rather risky. And both Mr. Nordstrom and Mr. Hicks, you both have extensive experience around the world and various places you've been. So looking at this proactively, I think this is probably the 9th or so hearing that the House has had on this issue. So maybe it's time we start looking at how we make sure we protect our embassies the very best way we can, rather than kind of going through and rehashing some of the same old stories. My question specifically for both Mr. Hicks and Mr. Nordstrom are, when it comes to extra training or extra security, do you feel that we need more in some of the embassies across the world, so that make sure that those who are working in there indeed have the very best protections, because we have that responsibility to them as they serve the country? Mr. Hicks?
Thank you. I think there are two things, and I appreciate the question. We in the State Department need more training for our people who are going to these critical threat posts, not only for our diplomatic security agents, but also for our everyday diplomats. We need to be able, in my opening statement, I talked about my experience in Bahrain of developing contacts who helped us get through some very difficult times in 2002 when our embassy was attacked twice and we were experiencing very severe anti-American demonstrations. We have to be able to engage. Our diplomats have to be out on the street. One of the reasons why we were perhaps caught off guard in Benghazi is because, for security purposes, because we had so few personnel there, the consulate was basically on lockdown. And so it was very difficult for our principal officer to get out and mingle with the people and learn what was going on. This was magnified when I talked with a correspondent after the event who had been in Benghazi after 9/11, and the correspondent told me that the people of Benghazi were terrified by these Islamic extremist militias. We didn't have that sense prior to 9/11. And the only way we could have that sense is if we're out on the street. I think Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, Sonnenschein, said it beautifully at the tribute for Ann Smedinghoff last week, when she quoted Correspondent Edward R. Murrow about going the last 3 feet. That's what we as diplomats do. So if we're going to be going outside the embassies to meet with people and learn what's going on, we have to have the training to be able to respond rapidly and effectively to a desperate situation. So that's one thing. The other thing I believe that we need to do, and I put this forth as part of my platform in running for office, in my speech to the Foreign Service, we need to develop a robust paradigm for analyzing and mitigating risk. and one that is comprehensible to every member of the Emergency Action Committee. And this would be a powerful tool for our regional security officers to be able to develop the kinds of programs and the kinds of activities that we need to mitigate risks that they identify through the use of this paradigm.
Thank you. We now go to Congress created the ARB in 1986, so we have the ability to professionalize it by congressional action. Perhaps that'll be something we'll recommend. We now go to the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your bravery in being here today and for your service to our nation. I really believe that the best way to honor the sacrifice of Ambassador Stevens and the 3 other Americans who gave their lives in the line of duty in a final act of devotion to this nation, the best thing that we can do is to put aside politics and take a hard look at the facts of what went wrong and what we need to do as we move forward to make sure this never, ever happens again. And I share the frustration that many of my colleagues have expressed about the fact that we did not have the opportunity to properly prepare for your testimony today, or to participate in a bipartisan investigation. I want to take a look particularly at what we can do to strengthen our missions, particularly in parts of the world where we cannot rely on host governments to provide.
In that same role before. So if anybody should understand this, I would hope that he would. So that's why I'm going to the point of there's something apparently wrong with the process of how those security recommendations are raised to the Secretary.
I agree. I think that you've given us a great way forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
But that's not really a place where we put recommendations. It's more laying out the situation, the crime, the political situation, and a lot of that reporting I had done previously with Washington.
And so they had recommendations from you or not?
It's my understanding, yes. They had wanted a transition plan specifically on how we were going to transition from the SST and the DS agents to our local bodyguards. That was submitted to them February 15th.
And do you know, was that implementation plan accepted? Was it implemented?
I never really got any feedback from Washington. That was one of the things that surprised me even when I left post. I was never contacted by DS leadership or management from the date I left on the 26th to this date. The only time I had any interaction was preparing before the October hearings, but they've never contacted me to ask me on thoughts about Libya, suggestions, anything like that.
Mr. Hicks, do you know whether security recommendations were implemented? Were there security recommendations that were implemented?
John Martinek, the RRSO, came on board, and he was following up on many of the things that Eric was working on before to strengthen our security posture in Libya. After the attacks, John and I worked on a list of physical security improvements that had to be made in Tripoli in order for us to remain there. And I cabled that list into the department after Congressman Chaffetz's visit. And I learned later that that cable was not well received by Washington leadership. To the ARB's credit, when they saw that cable, they sent it to Undersecretary Kennedy and insisted that every recommendation in that cable be implemented.
Thank you. I want to switch gears a little bit. Mr. Hicks, are you aware of any efforts by department officials to limit department witnesses' access to information about the attack prior to their testimony before Congress?
I have never seen the classified ARB report. So the answer is, in my respect, yes.
Mr. Nordstrom, do you know whether the State Department consciously sought to limit your awareness of certain information prior to your testimony before this committee?
I'm not aware of that.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Nordstrom. I want to read you an excerpt from an email Ambassador Stevens sent to you. and a colleague on July 5th, 2012. The email concerned a draft cable intended to request an extension of security personnel for the embassy, which was ultimately sent on July 9th. Now, the ambassador wrote, "Gentlemen, I have taken a close look at the cable and edited it down and rearranged some paragraphs. My intention was to give more focus to what we are doing to end our reliance on TDY support and to let the department figure out how to staff our needs. If it looks okay, please run it by DS and see if they want it front channel." Then, Mr. Nordstrom, can you briefly explain what Ambassador Stevens meant when he asked you to run it by DS and see if they wanted it front channel?
What he's referring to is the process by which we would send an official State Department cable. I had done that for prior requests, and it was my advice to the ambassador, I do remember that dialogue, that we do in fact send that front channel. Within the Department of State, that is considered to be the official record. If I sent something by email or informally discussed it by telephone, it's still valuable, but unless it's on that cable, it's not official. My experience in the past was that as soon as we put those recommendations, just as Greg just alluded to, as soon as we put that onto an official cable, somehow we were seen as embarrassing the Department of State because we are requiring them to live up to their end of the bargain.
Thank the gentlelady. We now go to the Illinois, Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I know that it's been a long day and lots of questions and answers have been shared. But let me ask the gentleman this. Last week, an unidentified individual who was described as a military special ops member appeared on national television to give an interview on the military's response to the attacks in Benghazi. The man appeared behind a black screen in order to conceal his identity. He suggested that military assets in Europe could have prevented the second attack in Benghazi. Specifically, he said this: "I know for a fact that C-110, the EUCOM, European Command, CIF Commanders and Extremist Force, was doing a training exercise not in the region of North Africa, but in Europe, and they had the ability to react and respond." He further stated, "We had the ability to load out, get on birds, that is aircraft, and fly there at a minimum stage. C-110 had the ability to be there, in my opinion, in 4 to 6 hours." He then went on to conclude that they would have been there before the second attack. Let me ask if any of you gentlemen are familiar with this claim.
Yeah, I've seen. I saw it on television.
Yes.
All right. In order to investigate the claim, last week Ranking Member Cummins wrote a letter to Secretary Hagel asking for the Defense Department's response. We've now received that written response from the department, and I'd like to enter that letter into the record, Mr. Chairman.
When we have it, we'll take it under advisement. I haven't seen it yet.
In regards to the anonymous allegation that the CIF could have arrived in Benghazi prior to the initiation of the second attack on the annex, the time needed from alerting the CIF to landing at the Benghazi airport is greater than the approximately 7.5 hours between the initiation of the first attack and that of the second one. The letter also says this: "The time requirements for notification, load, and transit alone prevented the CIF from being at the annex in time enough to change events." Does anyone disagree with that statement?
I think the only thing I would add to that, not being privy to the decisions on the ground on that day, what's valuable is none of us, including the committee, had those details but for that person coming forward and making that allegation. I think that's the point that minority Mr. Cummings made is that it's important to get these questions raised in this format. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see those same kinds of allegations because people do not feel that the answers have been provided or that those answers have been provided in a credible way. So I think it is much more important to get it done in this manner.
Thank you very much. The Defense Department's letter appears to be consistent with ARB report, which said this, and I quote, "The board found no evidence of any undue delays in decision-making or denial of support from Washington or from the military combatant commanders. Quite the contrary. The safe evacuation of all U.S. government personnel from Benghazi 12 hours after the initial attack and subsequently to Ramstein Air Force Base was the result of exceptional U.S. government coordination and military response and helped save the lives of 2 severely wounded Americans." So I don't know who that unidentified individual was on Fox News, but according to the Defense Department, his claim is incorrect. And so, Mr. Chairman, I simply wanted to get that into the record. And thank you very much.
Will the gentleman kneel? Will the gentleman kneel?
Yes.
Will the gentleman kneel?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Believe you yield to me,
I'm
correct?
yielding to Ms. Maloney.
Thank you very much. By all accounts, Ambassador Stevens was a remarkable man, and I wonder, was he aware how dangerous it was in Benghazi? And Mr. Hicks, were you aware how dangerous it was, yet he still made the decision to go there? Is that correct?
Gentleman's time has expired. You may answer.
Yes, the ambassador was very well aware of the security situation in Benghazi. Before he went, we had the chance to outbrief Eric Gaudiosi, the departing principal officer.
And not provide anything, even if requested by my personal emissary, Mr. Chaffetz, on that CODEL. Told you not to talk to him privately, even if he asked.
That's correct.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. We now go to the ranking member, Mr. Cummings.
Mr. Hicks, I was just listening to your testimony, and during your interview with the committee, you were asked point blank, and that was closer to the time that this happened, whether anyone at the department instructed you to withhold information from Representative Chavis. At any time during that trip, you were asked, and I quote, "Did you receive any direction about information that Congressman Chavis shouldn't be given from Washington?" And you replied, "No, I did not." Is that still your testimony? I'm just saying, this is your sworn testimony. I'm just looking at the testimony. You don't remember that?
I recall saying that I was instructed not to allow personal interviews with the
I'm not trying to twist you up. I'm just going on what you
I understand, but I recall also stating that I was not to allow personal interviews between Congressman Chaffetz, the RSO, the acting DCM, or me.
Okay, so in other words, you did say that you were told to make sure that other State Department officials were present. Is that right? Is that what?
That's correct.
Present for meetings with Representative Chaffetz, and
that's correct.
As you stated, and they told me not to be isolated with Congressman Chaffetz. Is that correct? They didn't tell you not to say anything, but they said don't be isolated. I guess
they said not to have a personal interview with him.
Yeah, by yourself. I'm just trying to make. I'm not trying to.
I understand.
I'm just trying to be clear. That's all.
I understand. I understand
Okay.
what you're.
Okay, now, Mr. Hicks, you said that 4 military personnel were told not to board that plane, and that this call, you don't know where it came from. That's what you said a few minutes ago. And so you did not know that it came from the Special Operations Command Africa?
I knew it came from Special Operations Command Africa. I do not.
You didn't know the individual?
I did not know who.
I got you. I just wanted to clear that up because it wasn't clear.
That's okay. Thank you.
On October 1st, 2012, the Secretary of State convened an Accountability Review Board led by Thomas Pickering, ambassador, Admiral Michael Mullen to investigate the attacks in Benghazi. After interviewing more than 100 people, viewing hours of videotape, and reviewing thousands of pages of documents, the ARB issued a very thorough report in December 2012, setting forth the results of its review. Mr. Hicks, did you meet with the ARB as part of that investigation?
I had an interview with them for about 2 hours.
Okay. And Mr. Nordstrom, did you meet with the ARB as a part of the investigation?
Yes, on multiple occasions.
It is my understanding that a cable went out to every employee at the State Department informing them of how to contact the ARB if they wanted to bring information forward. Mr. Thompson, did you receive that notice?
I did.
Right. And did you contact the ARB and request to meet with them?
I did.
And so did you end up meeting with the ARB as part of their review?
I did not.
Did anyone try to stop you from meeting with the ARB?
No.
Earlier this week, Congressman Chavis claimed that the ARB report was incomplete because they never even interviewed Secretary Clinton. According to Ambassador Pickering, the ARB met with Secretary Clinton near the end of their investigation, and during that time, they had the opportunity to discuss the report with her and could have asked her any questions they wanted. Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen have put out a joint statement.
I was just saying, I think that very clearly says they didn't interview her, they just talked about the report and could have, but didn't ask her. Is that right? I think it makes his case.
Well, that's why we need to have, no, I'm not trying to make any case. I'm just trying to get out the facts. But that's even more reason why we need to have Pickering in here, and I'm glad you've agreed to do that. And I just want to finish this question because I want to stay within the time limits. Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen have put out a joint statement that based on their thorough independent investigation, they assigned responsibility based on where they thought the responsibility lay. And that was not on Secretary Clinton. And this is what they said. And I quote, "From the beginning of the ARB process, we had unfettered access to everyone and everything, including all the documentation we needed. Our marching orders were to get to the bottom of what happened, and that's what we did," end of quote. Just wanted to, and again, we will, as you said, Mr. Nordstrom, we want to get a complete picture, and we'll hopefully be getting that complete picture very soon so that we can get to the point that we want to, and that is to reform so that these kinds of things are prevented from happening again. Thank you.
I think that's so true. We now go to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney.
Thank you, and I agree with Mr. Chavez completely that there should be equal exchange of information, that we should have access to all information. But the Democratic minority was denied access to a witness. The only way we knew anything about what Mr. Thompson was going to say was what we read in the press. Now, there should be equal access to witnesses, and there should be equal access to information.
Would the gentlelady yield?
On your time.
Well, hold the clock. Because you made an allegation, I don't understand. We didn't have a transcribed interview with 2 out of the 3 witnesses. Mr. Thompson was not made available to either. Mr. Nordstrom was in fact a previous witness, and we felt that there was sufficient information about what he felt. And Mr. Hicks, I think you went through 5 hours on a bipartisan basis. We forwarded their statements, not ours, their statements. We participated not at all in preparation. We forwarded them to the minority as we got them, period. So I'm a little bit concerned only in that there's nothing fair about partisan politics, but I believe we've fully complied deliberately with the spirit of the rules all along. So I would hope the gentlelady, when better informed, would appreciate that we tried to be very forthcoming. Now remember, these are whistleblowers.
Mr. Chairman, I'm all for equality, and we did get copies of Mr. Hicks's statements and Mr. Nordstrom, but your staff met with Mr. Thompson. Our staff was not allowed to meet with Mr. Thompson.
He's represented. It's just not true.
You didn't meet with him?
No, it's true that we have had some meetings with him, but we haven't prohibited or in any way. He's not our witness.
But the gentlelady yields.
He's Absolutely. A whistleblower that came forward.
Yeah, let me. I'm so glad we are stopping the clock. You are stopping the clock, right? We need to clear this up.
Well, I don't think there's anything to clear up.
No, I'm just whistleblowers. Yeah, and we want to protect whistleblowers. That's very, very important to us. The first thing, we have not gotten a syllable you've had conversations with Mr. Thompson. We've never had a conversation with Mr. Thompson. I see you looking over here, Mr. Gowdy, and you know that's not fair. And so all I'm saying to you is that we have a witness that came in here today that you had an opportunity to interview.
Well, I appreciate that.
And we never had that opportunity.
Well, you know what? Stop the clock for 1 second. One quick question. I'm asking the witnesses. Mr. Thompson, is it your decision who you talk to, and did any of my people ever tell you not to talk to the Democratic minority?
And I'm not accusing you of that.
No.
Okay, Mr. Hicks, have we ever suggested that you not talk to the minority, any of their people?
No.
Mr. Nordstrom, has anyone on my staff or any of my members ever asked you not to speak to them?
No, in fact, I spoke with both.
Thank you. That's resolved. The gentlelady may continue.
Well, we did request to meet with Mr. Thompson, and through his lawyer, he said no. But he did speak to the Republican staff. I'd like to go back to Mr. Chavitz's or other people's questioning about Cheryl Mills's phone call, and reading the transcripts of it, Mr. Hicks, you told our investigators that she did not seem happy when she heard that no other State Department official was in the classified briefing. Is that true?
She was unhappy that her minder, the lawyer that came with Congressman Chaffetz, was not included in that meeting.
Was she unhappy that no other State Department official was included? Just that State Department official?
That State Department official.
And you also said that she never criticized you, and according to your interview transcript, you said she never gave you any direct criticism. Do you stand by that statement today?
The statement was clearly no direct criticism, but the tone of the conversation, and again, this is part of the Department of State culture, the fact that she called me and the tone of her voice, and we're trained to gauge tone and nuance in language, indicated to me very strongly that she was unhappy. And it just, if I may...
My time is limited. Going to the diplomatic post in Benghazi, as I understand it, the British ambassador's convoy was attacked, a gentleman was killed, and they decided to pull out of Benghazi. Is that correct?
I don't believe anyone was killed. I believe we saved the life of one of those people. And I'd like to defer to Eric because he was actually the RSO there.
My question is, did the British ambassador close the post in Benghazi and leave?
He did.
He did. Do you think it was wise?
For that, though,
Excuse me, claiming my time, I will yield if somebody wants me to yield, but I wanted to ask, when we continued to stay there, do you think that was a wise decision for us to continue to stay in Benghazi after the English had closed their post and left?
Absolutely.
Why was it important for us to stay in Benghazi?
We needed to stay there as a symbolic gesture to a people that we saved from Gaddafi during the revolution. As we know, Gaddafi's forces were on the doorstep of Benghazi right before the NATO bombing commenced. And as a gesture, again, as I said before, Chris went there as a symbolic gesture to support the dream of the people of Benghazi to have a democracy.
And so he shared your position that staying there was incredible.
And he also understood from the secretary herself that Benghazi was important to us and that we needed to make it to be a permanent constituent post.
Now, I agree with my good friend on the other side of the aisle, Trey, that it was a long time before the FBI got on the ground. And as I understand it from a report that they gave us, they got the visas right away. The day of the Ambassador Rice's appearance on the Sunday shows, September 16, the Libyan government granted the FBI the visas so that the team could travel to Libya. Their flight clearance was granted the following day on September 17th, and the FBI arrived in Tripoli on September 18th. And according to this report, the team could not travel to Benghazi for some time due to the security situation on the ground. Is that true? Were all of our people out of Benghazi? And were we not letting anyone in Benghazi? What exactly was happening then, Mr. Hicks?
Yes, the Libyan government did not want any of our personnel to go to Benghazi because of the security situation there.
So when the FBI went to Benghazi, it was when the Libyan government felt that it was secure enough for them to go there. Is that a fair statement?
We strung together a series of approvals at the mid to upper levels from the government and organized a military escort to go with the FBI and special forces troops that escorted them as well.
Now go to her friend, Mr. Trey Gowdy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am trying to reconcile how Benghazi was not safe enough for the Federal Bureau of Investigation to go, but it was safe enough to leave a below-spec facility for our diplomats to stay in. I'm just trying to reconcile those 2 points. It's too dangerous for the Bureau, who are trained law enforcement officials, but it's just fine for diplomats. At some point, I'll reconcile that. Let me do this, Mr. Hicks. I'm going to dust off something called the best evidence rule. The best evidence of what you said when you were asked about Mr. Chaffetz's visit is actually what you said. So here it is. Those instructions were to arrange the visit in such a way that Representative Chaffetz and his staff would not have the opportunity to interview myself, John Martinick, and David McFarland alone. That's what you said in the deposition. So there shouldn't be any ambiguity about who said what when. That's your testimony. Now, I'd like to try to weave this tapestry together because this will be the last opportunity I have certainly today to talk to you. If I understand your testimony correctly, Mr. Hicks, and I want to be fair about it, so if I mischaracterize anything, you need to correct me. If I understand your testimony in part, the ambassador was interested in going to Benghazi because of interest that Secretary Clinton had in Benghazi. Is that fair?
That's fair.
All right. Now, Mr. Dorsum, same thing to you. And if I'm unfair in my characterization, you need to correct me. I thought I understood your testimony to be that Secretary Clinton alone was able to approve facilities that were below specs.
That's correct. Part of the specs. There's two categories. SECA and OSPB. She is the only one that can authorize waivers for SECA. In this case, both apply because we didn't meet either.
So we are able to show that in part he went to Benghazi because of Secretary Clinton. In part, Benghazi was still open despite the fact it was below specs because of Secretary Clinton. And now to my third point, to complete the circle, who is Cheryl Mills?
Counselor and Chief of Staff to the Secretary.
And she was copied on that email that I know my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are going to have a press conference on as soon as we get out of here, calling on the State Department to release this email. I know it. Because I have heard all afternoon about denying access to documents, and they do not want to deny the public or the media access to this document. So I know they're going to call on the State Department to release this non-classified email, which Cheryl Mills was copied on, which demonstrably undercuts Susan Rice's talking points. And Cheryl Mills was copied on that email.
Mr. Gowdy, if I could add, Cheryl Mills was also the person that led our preparation for our October testimony. I'd never met her before, but that was explained to me who she was afterwards.
And apparently, she was also less than pleased with Mr. Chaffetz's visit to Libya, if I understood that testimony correctly, which I find stunning. He's a subcommittee chairman on Oversight, one of the more decent human beings I've ever met. I've never known him to inspire that strong of emotion in anyone other than Ms. Mills. Let me say this to you, Ambassador, in conclusion. You have made a compelling case today for why it is important to tell other countries the truth. You made a compelling case that the decision not to tell the truth on Sunday morning talk shows adversely impacted our ability to get to Benghazi. You made a compelling case. All three of you have made a compelling case today on why it is important for government to tell the truth to its own citizens. So you made the case why we have to tell the truth to other countries, and you made the case on why you have to tell the truth to your own citizens. So if anyone wants to know what difference does it make, Anyone wants to ask what difference does it make? It always matters whether or not you can trust your government. And to the families, we're going to find out what happened in Benghazi, and I don't give a damn whose career is impacted. We're going to find out what happened. And with that, I would yield.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll be happy to.
We're going to be winding down. There's a vote call, but I want to ask each of you, you're whistleblowers. You're the kind of people that give us information we wouldn't otherwise have. Do you believe what you're doing today is what we need to keep doing? In other words, do we need other whistleblowers to come forward, other fact witnesses who know what we don't currently know? And I'm not asking you to ask if this was a great process or you enjoyed it, but was it worthwhile, in your opinion, as people who have now gone through this process? Mr. Thompson?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hicks?
Yes, I do.
Mr. Nordstrom?
Absolutely.
Well, since we're going to Mr. Langford next, I hope you continue to feel that way. Mr. Langford?
Mr. Nordstrom, I just need to follow up on a conversation we had earlier dealing with the cable that you said March the 28th, 2012. You had mentioned that you drafted that cable requesting additional personnel for both the embassy in Tripoli and in Benghazi because you were very much short. And as time was expiring, that SST team were leaving, you knew you were not going to have enough people. You mentioned you drafted the cable. Your intention was, and your assumption was, the executive leadership, including the undersecretary all the way to the secretary, would see that cable or at least be briefed on that cable and the request for that security. There's been a lot of discussion about the official response that came back on April the 19th. Who do you think saw or the intention or at least reflected the opinion of when that cable came back to you? When that cable response came back to you, who was the assumption that was actually responding to you?
Normally, someone would tell me exactly who it is, or they would indicate who the point of contact was. If I recall correctly, that's still unknown to me. I assume that it's coming from DS, but as I testified to before, so many of these decisions seem to be at Ambassador Kennedy's level or higher. Clearly, that was cleared by some of those other officials.
All right, so you're assuming this is the undersecretary or on up somewhere that had personal knowledge of that.
Certainly saw it ahead of time.
Of that cable that came back. It is an established fact that there's video of the attack. There are clear video of the attackers the night. The FBI has done an extensive investigation. We're now months past that time. Are any of you aware of anyone who has been held to account for the murders that happened in Libya? Anyone detained? Anyone arrested? Anyone captured? Are you aware of anything that has happened to any of the attackers to hold them to account?
Neither the perpetrators nor the persons that made decisions. Again, the 4 people that were named in the ARB were put on administrative leave. I understand one of them is trying to come back off of that leave and go to be the RSO in NATO, which is shocking to me.
So at this point, no one is aware of anyone who's been held to account in any way for the murder of 4 Americans?
Not that I'm aware of.
In 1998, we've discussed frequently, there was the bombing of the embassy in Kenya and Tanzania. There was an ARB at the end of that as well. And let me just read you the 3 findings at the end of that ARB that was done in 1999. It said this: number 1, State Department of Washington did not assess the threats or take notes of the clear warning signs and escalating threats. Number 2, noted the facility was inadequate for even the most modest of attack. And number 3, there was a lack of preparations or warning systems at the facility. That could have been written a month ago. We have discussed often on this. The one thing we have to do is learn the lesson. In 1998, this same thing occurred, and we have not learned the lesson. What we know of today, and the realities that have come out and through all that you've contributed to this conversation, and what you've contributed is invaluable, is that we did not do the most basic minimum security that was required by the State Department standards set after the bombings in Nairobi, Kenya, and in Tanzania. We did not do the basics. We did not provide the level of security. There were, in fact, cameras that were in the box still in Benghazi because a technical person had never been sent to actually install those, and so there could have been additional warning signs, but they had not actually been installed and done. We know that the Tripoli facility was even at a greater risk than Benghazi. There were even more vulnerabilities in Tripoli than there were at Benghazi, both in physical security around the facility and in actual staffing, people that are the gun toters, as you mentioned before, the door kickers and such, people that would actually be there to be able to provide that security. The minimum level was not provided. In fact, my understanding, Mr. Hicks, is that it reached such a point of vulnerability that you actually approached some of the diplomatic security and asked for the diplomats to be trained in how to handle a gun because there was such a fear of the people on the ground because you were so exposed. Is that true?
It's true.
We have got to learn the lessons of the past. This happened in 1998. We allowed it to happen again. The State Department has to put into practice their own standards and put into place the things we know to be right. We cannot allow a place that's listed as critical and high risk to our personnel to be ignored and to not have the support they need. If there's any one gain that we can do in any one way to be able to honor those that have fallen is that we actually do learn the lesson and we protect our diplomats with what is required. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Micah. Mr. Hicks, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yes, I'd just like to make a clarification with respect to conversation with the ranking member. There's no inherent contradiction between denying or avoiding a private interview with someone and making sure that he has information available. I just want to be clear on that.
Mr. Micah.
Thank you. Mr. Nordstrom, I don't think I've ever read so much testimony, but what you provided last night I thought was particularly informative. And talking about the on page 7, you talk about the rating level assigned for threat categories for our various posts. And there are 4 of them: critical, high, medium, and low. And we have 264 posts that where we had security concerns, overseas diplomatic posts at the time of Benghazi. There were 14 posts rated as either high or critical, not a huge number, but 14. Two of the posts were Benghazi and